Namaskar to all of you, and a heartfelt gratitude for being here. This is a series on Sri Aurobindo's book Synthesis of Yoga, and the last talk on this series was on the chapter Standards of Conduct and Spiritual Freedom. There we explored in that chapter how the outer needs and desires of an individual and the outer needs and desires of the collective group with which that individual identifies, how they bind the individual with a sense of good and bad and certain standards. It is a feeling that if I comply by those standards, then I am accepted by the individual and the collective. But if I don't comply, then there is a sense of non-acceptance. And then if one chooses to be driven by the inner standards of intellectual idealism, where one gives it a definition of what is love, compassion and truth, and one chooses to be driven by that, eventually one realizes that even that carries within it a kind of a half light and a half ignorance, and gradually turns into a binding on one's own spiritual freedom. These are useful steps moving forward in the human evolution, but eventually it is the inner guide which has to take the center stage. Because in a way, what is good and what is evil, what is good is anything that takes us forward in our movement towards the divine, and what is evil is anything that retards that movement towards the divine. And in process, if we have to hold some outer standards, because our connection with the inner guide for all of us is ever evolving, so in the process of our outer evolution, we might still have to hold some standards. We hold them with flexibility, we hold them with lightness, we hold them with an understanding that they are transient and temporary in nature. And this flexibility is very important also for our confidence in our day-to-day life. Because in a way, our confidence in practical life comes from setting goals for ourselves and achieving them. For example, a child with a capacity to get 60 to 70% marks suddenly sets himself the standards of getting 95% marks. He may try very hard and may even get there, but there is a high likelihood that he may not get there and in process lose confidence, and may even end up losing confidence to get 60 to 70%. So it is very imperative for us to take those little steps forward, and the child may choose to progress and set a goal for himself to earn 75%, and in process he works hard and gets there, and then sets a target for another 5%, and eventually boosts his confidence. So same flexibility is also required on the path of yoga in setting standards for ourselves. If one says to oneself that from today onwards I am just going to listen to the inner voice, the inner divine voice, and that is what I am going to follow, it may not translate into practical outcomes. And that is why the importance of an accurate assessment of where one stands today in one's life. if we are largely driven by an animalistic, vitalistic nature, then the first step forward is to develop certain social values, to work for the family, to work for the nation. If one is already developed in one's collective social sense and in individualism, then one can take little step forward towards developing the intellect and reflect on the values of truth, love, compassion, beauty. And it is a movement, it's a kind of a movement from tamas, where there is an entire focus on our vitalistic nature, to a movement of rajas, where one moves towards a social success, and then finally towards sattva, where one brings in the divine light to a certain degree by creating ideals of truth, love, and beauty. And all through this movement, one nurtures that inner connection with the psychic being or the inner guide, and grows in it and learns to listen to that inner voice more and more. The next question that arises out of this very often is that what kind of an identity and what kind of relationships that one chooses to continue with on the path of yoga as one grows in the divine identity. And there one has the choice of taking up entirely a polar approach, where on one side one identifies oneself with the physical body and being this physical individual, and then naturally the relationships and the ties that one has through this physical body take over, and the social necessities take up a priority, and very often that inner voice is forgotten. On the other polar extreme, one may take up the identity with the inner guide and the divine inside us, and may choose to disregard entirely all the external relationships and ties. And in process, it becomes into a certain aloofness and indifference towards one's social duties and even one's own self-care. And Sri Aurobindo, as he usually does, he integrates these two polar opposites and gives us the formula of a free self-identification and a progressive liberation, which means it's a kind of a loveful detachment from our physical self, from all the relationships and ties with the collective, and yet a complete identification with the divine inside us. And it is then this divine will which guides us what identity to choose and what relationships or what laws to still respect and obey, and what relationship and ties one has to respectfully disregard. And the respect word is very important here, because if we disrespect and disregard, we end up with even more attachment to those things. And Sri Aurobindo describes this in his words: if any social law is obeyed, it will not be from physical necessity or from the sense of personal interest or because of the pressure of the environment or from any sense of duty, but solely for the sake of the Lord of the works. So one is not doing things out of the musts and the shoulds which our own individualistic mind and that of the collective imposes upon us. So it is not from a physical necessity or from the pressure of the environment or from the sense of duty, but solely for the sake of the Lord of the works. That Lord of the works represent that inner space of an unconditional acceptance, not a conditional acceptance and love. It's the space of unconditional love and acceptance from where we can seek guidance, because it is felt or known to be the divine will. So one follows any social law only for the sake of the Lord of the works, because it is felt or known to be the divine will that the social law or rule or relation as it stands can still be kept as a figure of the inner life, and the minds of the men must not be disturbed by its infringement. So it is a kind of an obeying of that space, inner space, and there is a feeling inside that this social law or these relations can still continue to be a part of our life and is in a certain degree of alignment with the expression of the divine will. If, on the other hand, the social law is disregarded, that too will not be for the indulgence of desire, personal will, or personal opinion, but because a greater rule is felt that expresses the law of the spirit. So here Sri Aurobindo emphasizes that as we rise above the musts and shoulds, it is also not to now act out of our own personal egoistic will, and if something is to be disregarded, that also is again driven by the divine will, which wishes to express a greater rule. So the take-home message in this is that whatever relations or identities we take up is another thing. When we seek guidance from the divine, it is not just on what action to do, it is also on what identity and relations to continue to hold. And when we talk about this guidance, so to say, and this divine will guiding us, then the next question that emerges is that what is that divine will, and where is that divine will, and how do we contact this divine or supreme will? In one of the previous chapters, Sri Aurobindo talks in detail about the psychic being, which is the mediator between the human faculties and this divine will. And this chapter, which is called as the Supreme Will, is a window for us into discovering the Supreme Will. And the first step that Sri Aurobindo recommends us to take is to loosen our identification with the superficial self, the transient superficial self, which we call as I or my. Because this superficial self is also a construct of the Prakriti or the forces of the nature, which molds these thoughts and these emotions in us and centralizes it around an ego, which we call as I, and it feels like I am thinking these thoughts and I am having these emotions and I am doing these actions. But actually, these thoughts and these actions are happening to us. These emotions, these vital feelings are happening to us. And Sri Aurobindo describes this as there is a personality on the surface that chooses and wills, submits and struggles, tries to make good in nature or prevail over nature, but this personality is itself a construction of nature. So this outer superficial self with a centralization of ego that we call as I is trying to struggle with the nature and trying to dominate with the nature. But the truth is that this personality is itself a construction of nature, and so dominated and driven and determined by her that it cannot be free. So this ego is trying to gain freedom, but it cannot be because it itself is a construction of this nature. It is a formation or an expression of the self in her. It is a self of the nature rather than a self of the self. It is a formation, it is a self of the nature rather than a self of the self. We can understand this with an analogy of a broken mirror or one of those funny mirrors that you have in children's museums which are concave and convex. And we can liken our superficial self to the distorted reflections that we see in the mirror. And as that, how it would be for that reflection to feel that it can harmonize itself, it can reconstruct the mirror, which we can liken to the nature and the forces of nature. The truth is that that reflection doesn't have any control over the mirror nor over itself. And if that reflection aspires to actually be a true reflection of the individual, the step one always is to de-identify from being that reflection or that superficial self and identify with that deeper self or that actual individual standing in front of the mirror. And that self of nature can be depicted as that reflection in the mirror, and the true self of self is that individual standing in front of the mirror. And as we make that movement from being that reflection to that individual, what is required is to become an observer or a witness, or as in Sanskrit they say, being the Purusha. So making that separation from the Prakriti and the reflection and being the Purusha and the witness. From being a slave of action to being a student of action and witnessing the work of different forces of nature within oneself. And it is something to be done with a certain level of intensity, because the nature is full of intense forces of conflict, of anger, of cravings, that as we start witnessing, very often we are again pulled out into being that reflection and the mirror and losing that space of being a witness. A great sage one gave an analogy for this intensity, that if one finds oneself in a room with a snake and the snake is watching you, and if you wish to exit the room, the kind of calmness and lightness and an intensity of observation that one needs actually to exit that room, how gently you will do that, is the kind of intensity that is required in observing the flow of these emotions and thoughts. And here Sri Aurobindo writes that thus calm, detached, a student of himself, a witness of his nature, he realizes that he is the individual soul who observes the works of nature, accepts tranquilly her results, and sanctions or withholds his sanction from the impulse to her acts. So detached, one becomes an observer and a witness and accepts calmly whatever outcomes are emerging, and then either sanctions further movements or withholds the sanction. So from being a slave of action to a student of action, one gradually learns to sanction or withhold the sanction. And even though Prakriti tends to persist with its own old movements, but as the soul learns to persist and insist on a certain specific intentions and actions, eventually it prevails over the Prakriti. And when that starts happening to an individualized soul, then one moves from being a student of action to being a master of action. So the movement goes from being a slave of action when we are identified with the superficial self, to then being a student and then further being the master of action. And this is what truly is meant by an inner spiritual control vis-a-vis an outer mental and egoistic control, which is a cornerstone of yoga, learning inner spiritual control or self-control. Going one step further, just like one becomes a student or an observer of the forces of Prakriti at work in us, one can also become an observer of the universal divine mother or the Shakti present above and around us. And to become aware of this universal divine mother, one has to call in faith and patience and surrender. Because the divine mother or Shakti is not something one can grab hold of and put it on the Prakriti. If there is to be a contact with the divine mother, it happens through surrender. A surrender of the individualized soul, a surrender of all the faculties of that individual. And as that happens, one moves, as the journey began, from the slave to the student to the master. One starts to become truly the instrument of the Divine Mother or the Divine Will. And how often it happens to us that we are still a slave of action and we aspire to be an instrument and start surrendering too often. And in this movement, Sri Aurobindo signifies that one doesn't have to skip the steps. It is important to first gain a certain level of inner spiritual control and then only talk about the true surrender to the Divine Mother. And here Sri Aurobindo goes one step further, that as one becomes aware of the Divine Mother, as one surrenders with more and more faith, one can also become aware of the highest dynamic self, which is the Ishvara and the Shakti. And he writes that finally he becomes aware of that highest dynamic self within him and within nature, which is the source of all his seeing and knowing. So whatever the Purusha was witnessing, the source of that witnessing is the Ishvara Shakti. The source of the sanction, the source of the acceptance, and the source of the rejection. So the power behind the sanction and the rejection of the Purusha is also Ishvara Shakti. This is the Lord, the Supreme, the one in all, Ishvara Shakti, of whom his soul is a portion, a being of that being, a power of that power. So, Purusha and Prakriti and Ishvara and Shakti, if we look at it in a little more detail, when we start with this separation or observing as a witness, it still carries a component of ignorance because there is a separation between the static observer and the dynamic Prakriti. But when one starts to identify with the Ishvara and Shakti, here there is a complete union because Ishvara carries Shakti within itself as a potential, and Shakti carries the Ishvara within itself as an intention, as an essence of its action. So here there is a complete union and oneness, and this Ishvara Shakti stands behind the Purusha and Prakriti and uses the Purusha as a mold or as an instrument to turn the ignorant action of the Prakriti into an illuminated action. And it's a moment of gratitude for all of us that how beautifully Sri Aurobindo clearly explains this roadmap or pathway of yoga and these concepts of Purusha and Prakriti and Ishvara and Shakti, which can be confusing for any sadhak. How clearly he lays down the roadmap. In one of the previous chapters, he describes this as the lower nature and the higher nature. And in this chapter, he first describes how does one gain a certain level of mastery over the lower nature before the movement towards the higher nature, which is the Ishvara Shakti. And then the next question that emerges out of this is that how does this Ishvara Shakti act? Is it an action of possibilities and well thought out pros and cons, or it is a kind of a seeing by the Ishwar which naturally carries a potential for manifestation? It is a kind of a seeing which is a creative power and naturally manifests. It's like a fountain or a sun from where there is a natural outpouring of action. And as the individual soul learns to identify with this Ishvara Shakti, one can have an actual experience of this spontaneous action. And until, as a soul, one learns to identify with the Supreme Will, one can receive this action or the divine Supreme Will of Ishvara Shakti as intuitions in the thought or as feelings and impulsions in the body and the heart. And this receptivity can go to its maximum in states of what one may call it as a state of a zone or a flow, which is something which is very much sought after by the mind-body medicine or by the performance in enhancement industry. It is a state very often described by artists or scientists or by intellectuals or by sports people, that they find themselves in a certain state of stillness from where a spontaneous action, a perfect action emerges, or a kind of a new discovery or a perception emerges. Physiologically, that state is a state of a complete left and right brain synergy and resonance. Left brain kind of signifying our intellectual or a logical self, and the right brain, the visuospatial or a 3D organizing self. So when both of them act in a complete synchrony is when one experiences a higher state of receptivity towards these divine impulsions. And based on this, Sri Aurobindo gives us the 3 steps or 3 levels of general progress on this path of yoga. The first, where we are still largely driven by the intellect and the heart and the senses, and there are these fleeting moments of receiving this supreme will in moments of stillness, which is true how it is for the artists and the scientists and the sports people. And then the next level is when one starts to develop a certain level of a spiritualized mind and an illumined mind in place of the intellect, and one develops an inner psychic heart in the place of the heart, and a pure selfless vital in place of the outer senses. And that is where the supreme will starts to replace the action of the individual will, and there is a more continuous flow of these divine impulsions. And lastly, there can be a possibility of an entire communion with this individual will, and that happens at the level above the mind, at the level of supramental, which kind of what Didi talked about for Guru Nanak, that whatever he thought of would actually start manifesting, and how he saw himself as a slave of the divine, an instrument of the divine, and at the same time he was in an experience of oneness with the supreme will as well. So to summarize, again, it is a movement from being a slave of action to being a student of action, to being a master of action, to being an instrument of the divine will, to ultimately a possibility of an experience of oneness with the divine will. And we started with the fact that there is an importance to being flexible in what kind of standards we hold for ourselves. So even though we may aspire for the highest, but it's very important to immediately look at what is that one little step we can take forward in moving forward on this process of yoga, and gaining that confidence and momentum in the process. And that one little step may be to observe with intensity. Even though the movement is expressed as a linear A to B to C movement, but that is not how generally things manifest for us. Actually, all these processes, whether it is observation or sanctioning or withholding the sanction, or a mastery over action, or a surrender, or a union with the divine, it's actually happening simultaneously for a sadhak to a varying degree. But it's just good to look at it in a linear flow and fashion. And Sri Aurobindo ends this chapter with the lines of Gita: with a heart practice unfalteringly, with a heart free from despondency. For even though in the earlier stage of the path we drink deep of the bitter poison of internal discord and suffering, the last taste of this cup is the sweetness of the nectar of immortality, the honey wine of eternal Ananda. Om Sarva Mangala Mangalye शिवे सर्वार्थ साधिके शरण्ये त्र्यंबके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सर्वमंगल मांगल्ये शिवे सर्वार्थ साधिके शरण्ये त्र्यंबके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सर्वमंगल मांगल्ये शिवे सर्वार्थ साधिके शरण्ये त्र्यंबके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। Thank you.